it is certainly worth asking, does probability really exist? And what on earth would it be? I would answer no, it does not exist. Someone once asked me, rather ironically, why on earth I even bother with it. After I gave this answer, emphasized with the all caps motto, probability does not exist, in the English preface of Teoria delle probabilità. Well, I could also say the reverse without contradiction. Probability is everywhere, and it is, or at least should be, our guide in thinking and acting, which is why it interests me. The trouble is that realism, as Jeffreys cleverly observed, has the advantage that language was created by realists, and even by very primitive realists, and therefore we have vast possibilities of describing the properties attributed to objects, but very little of describing those directly experienced as sensations. From these stems the obsession, which for some might be a sign of wisdom, seriousness, or acuity, with absolutizing, concretizing, even objectifying those things that are merely properties of our subjective attitudes. Otherwise, how would you explain the effort to make probability into something nobler than it is, to quote Jeffreys again, by hiding its subjective nature and dressing it up as objective? According to Hans Freudenthal's imaginative take, it might be seen as a kind of odd modesty intended to stop us from seeing probability as God made it. It requires a fig leaf, and often it is covered entirely with fig leaves, rendering it even invisible or unrecognizable. Ladies and gentlemen, signori e signore, these are some of the words Bruno de Finetti wrote for an Italian encyclopedia under the entry probabilità, that is, probability. The translation is mine. Welcome back to The Logic of Risk, episode 9. And as you might have guessed from this introductory reading, today we are talking about subjective probability, the epistemological and Bayesian view. And we are going to meet heavyweights like Frank Ramsey, Bruno de Finetti, Leonard Savage, Sir Harold Jeffreys, and many other friends. In previous episodes, we considered three important definitions of probability. There is the classical one, historically the first, and two expressions of the objectivist school, namely frequentism a la von Mises and company, and Popper's propensities and his crew's vision. Today, we are looking at the other side of the coin, focusing on the subjectivist interpretation of probability. Okay, the idea is simple. Probability and its assessment are inseparable from the evaluating subject. Probability isn't something that exists on its own. Rather, it is something we create, develop, and modify in our minds as we face something that we perceive as random. Each of us, when estimating the probability of an event, whether we like it or not, is always influenced by our own beliefs, knowledge, available information, and cultural context. And these despite the obsession with objectifying even those things that are merely properties of our subjective attitudes. To quote De Finetti once more. Let's get one thing straight. Putting aside one of the most banal criticisms leveled against probabilistic subjectivism. The fact that probability is subjective doesn't imply that multiple people can't reach an agreement, nor does it mean that any outlandish opinion is valid. In everyday life, we come to agreements with one another even when starting from different points of view. Think of price negotiations, couples deciding where to spend the weekend, agreements among friends, as well as commercial deals. We'll soon see that there are very effective ways to ensure the reliability of subjective probabilities, their comparability and their communicability. For example, we can reason in terms of equivalence and coherence. Remember equivalence? Two probability measures are said to be equivalent if they agree on what is impossible. In other words, if an event has zero probability under one measure, it will also have zero probability under the other. However, when it comes to what is possible, that is, events with positive probability, they can differ greatly. If two individuals have equivalent views, it is already a great starting point. As for coherence, we'll return to that in just a minute. One great merit of the subjectivist view is that it elegantly and uniquely solves the problem of distinguishing between mass random phenomena and singular events. For the subjectivist perspective, the definition of probability is the same, and so is its use. Notice, this does not deny the difficulty of estimating the probability of certain phenomena. In fact, it does not allow for exceptions. The defining rule remains the same. Some scholars, usually critics, go so far as to say that subjectivism even erases the distinction between risk and uncertainty, making everything falsely measurable, even when it isn't. In reality, as observed by Feduzzi, Runde, and Zappia, things are not like that, especially in the De Finettian subjectivism, and we will return to these in the episode on uncertainty. But first, we need to lay the groundwork. Within the subjectivist universe, there are different interpretations and nuances, but when we get down to the brass tacks, the differences are minimal, so I will try to focus on the substance, deliberately leaving out the details. And with these last words, I have already drawn the ire of the purists. How dare I mix the pure epistemic view, the operational epistemic view, radical probabilism, and the Bayesian approach, just to name a few subjectivist variants? The answer is simple. This is a podcast about risk, not a one-topic course on subjective probability. I am interested in showing you the richness of the concept of probability, which is not that monolith that many believe it to be, creating monsters in the process, but rather a porous concept, increasingly uncertain the deeper you delve into its study. And the differences within subjectivism are not so pronounced unless you want to get into discussions that go beyond the scope of our talks. In the debate between objectivists and subjectivists, which, as you know, doesn't really captivate me much since I consider myself a pragmatist and I try to consciously use the approach that is most useful for the specific case, as I will show you in a few episodes, I have always found it amusing how the opposing sides fail to realize how much they actually have in common. Take Popper's propensities for singular events, the idea of conjecture stripped of the desire not to be a subjectivist, and then tell me if you really consider it to be something objective, detached from the subject. Or take a Bayesian who has no prior idea about the phenomenon under investigation and who, in the presence of lots of data, ends up looking at relative frequencies like a frequentist, perhaps ignoring the tails, though denying it because he is using a non-informative prior. If the part about the Bayesian isn't clear, don't worry, we'll get back to it shortly. A very clever point of view, especially considering the time it was developed, is that of Laplace, who in 1814, in his Essai philosophique sur les probabilités, introduced what would be remembered as Laplace demon or spirit. Here are his words. We can view the current state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect that, at a given moment, knew all the forces that drive nature and all the elements that compose it, and if this intellect were vast enough to analyze all these data, would be able to encapsulate in a single formula the movements of the largest bodies in the universe and those of the smallest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, like the past, would stand clear before its eyes. But Laplace knew very well that we humans aren't that spirit, that demon. We don't have the analytical capabilities, nor do we have all the information, and so chance and contingency emerge for us. That's when the doors open for calculating probability, and it all starts from our limitations. We are the ones who invent probability, just as we invent risk. A fact well known to those who have recited the Bhagavad Gita, one of the sacred texts of Hinduism, multiple times in the first millennium BCE. This will be one of the starting points of our history of risk in a future episode. Without us, probability and risk would not exist. So, can they really be something objectively real? Probability doesn't exist. Or rather, it doesn't exist in itself. We create it. And how? That's essentially the question on which subjectivists differ, though not by much. If we look at what Frank Ramsey writes in his 1926 article, Truth and Probability, probability isn't something separate from individual knowledge. It doesn't represent a body of universal knowledge, something that would then remind us a bit of propensities and conjecture if we recall last episode. No, probability is intimately connected to the person who estimates it. Ramsey, I mentioned him a few episodes ago, is one of those who died young, but he left an important legacy for probability theory and more. A friend of Wittgenstein, he was the first to translate the Tractatus into English. His Truth and Probability is nothing more than a critical response to his very famous professor, Keynes. We will talk about Keynes in the next episodes when we deal with logicism, but the idea of a universal corpus is exactly his. In fact, in the view of logicism as a bridge between objectivism and subjectivism, we can safely say that Keynes leans more toward the first. In Ramsey's thinking, we find fascinating hints of what would later become, in economics, Samuelson's theory of revealed preferences, as well as that notion of probability independently developed by De Finetti and Savage. For Ramsey, the probabilities each of us assigns to life's events can be deduced from observing our actions. This deduction is more precise the clearer the alternatives and the sharper the consequences of the choices. Probability is nothing more than the numerical expression of our beliefs and convictions, which are influenced by our knowledge, our information, and the context in which we make an evaluation. The theory of probability, paraphrasing Ramsey, defines a logic of partial beliefs. Partial meaning based on that limited knowledge that makes us human and not gods. Because of his untimely death, Ramsey was never able to resolve some of the more technical issues which we will gloss over regarding his view of subjective probability, but all later subjectivists have acknowledged his importance. Among them are De Finetti and Savage. Savage, a brilliant mind, was one of the greatest defenders of subjective probability against the attacks of objectivists, and he was the one who contributed the most to spreading the De Finetti's ideas in the Anglo-Saxon world. For now, we will mainly deal with De Finetti, because we will cover Savage's contributions more specifically later when we talk about subjective expected utility, minimax regret, and the 0-1 law. For anyone interested, I can only recommend Savage's 1954 essay, The Foundations of Statistics. To enrich your personal library on De Finetti, I suggest Theory of Probability. The text is full of fascinating insights, and although it is structured as a study manual, large parts of it can be enjoyed as a beautiful mathematical philosophical essay that allows you to better understand De Finetti's view. And when it comes to De Finetti, it is also essential to mention the website brunodefinetti.it, which contains plenty of resources of this great Italian scientist of the 20th century, including some articles that are now hard to find in Italian and French if you speak these languages. Or maybe it is an incentive to learn these two beautiful languages. And if you're feeling a bit lazy, you can load the files into ChatGPT or similar tools and have them translated. According to De Finetti, as well as Ramsey and Savage, the numerical value of probability, that number between 0 and 1 that we assign to random events, can be expressed as the outcome of a bet. The De Finetti view, if we want to be pedantic, is called the operational epistemic view. The probability of event capital E is the fair price of a bet that pays €1 or $1 if you prefer, if the event capital E occurs, where fair is understood according to the personal evaluation of the individual. So, if the event capital E is that it will rain tomorrow, and I, looking at the clouds, estimate the probability at 30%, it is as if I'm entering a bet where I'm willing to pay 30 cents, that is €0.3 or dollar, to win €1 or $1 if it rains. If, on the other hand, one of you believes rain is more likely, because you have seen the weather forecast or whatever, you would probably be willing to bet a larger amount, say 65 cents, obviously exposing yourself to a greater potential loss if it turns out sunny. For you, the probability of rain will be 65%. For De Finetti, it makes no sense to talk about the probability of an event unless it is in relation to the body of knowledge a person has. Subjective probability is therefore a tool to give a reliable measure of that which cannot be measured objectively. And that's where I will stop for today. We will continue in the next episode. Ciao ciao!